I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from. The casket was closed because Isabella insisted the accident was too severe for an open viewing. Standing there in my black dress, watching mourners file past what was supposedly my son's body, I received a text that made my knees buckle. "Mom, I'm alive. That's not me in the coffin." My hands trembled so violently I nearly dropped my phone. The room swam before my eyes as I desperately tried to maintain my composure. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Let me back up and tell you how this nightmare began. My name is Carmen Perez, 67 years old, recently retired after teaching high school English for 42 years. I'd raised my son Mateo as a single mother after his father walked out when Mateo was just 6. We were close, or so I believed. The funeral home smelled of lilies and grief, that peculiar mixture of flowers, tears, and whispered condolences. I'd chosen a simple service, though Isabella had pushed for something more elaborate. "He deserves the best, Carmen," she'd insisted, her perfect makeup never smudging despite her constant tears. Mateo had married Isabella 3 years ago, a woman I'd tried my best to love despite the red flags. She was controlling, manipulative, and had an unsettling way of inserting herself between Mateo and everyone who cared about him. But I bit my tongue because I wanted my son to be happy. "Senora Perez, I'm so sorry for your loss." Mrs. Alvarez from next door embraced me, her familiar perfume momentarily grounding me. "Mateo was such a good boy, always helped me with my groceries." I nodded mechanically, barely hearing her words. My mind raced with questions. If Mateo was alive, who or what was in that casket, and why would my son fake his death? Isabella stood beside me, a vision of grief in her designer black dress that probably cost more than my monthly pension. Every few minutes, she'd squeeze my hand or lean against me for support. "Thank you for being so strong, Carmen," she whispered, her voice breaking at exactly the right moment. "Mateo would be so proud." The performance was flawless, too flawless. Her mascara remained perfect, despite hours of supposed crying. Her voice trembled with emotion that never quite reached her eyes. But now, with my son's text burning in my pocket, I saw something calculated in her grief. Father Rodriguez approached with sympathetic eyes. "Carmen, would you like to say a few words before we conclude the service?" I looked at the closed casket, then at Isabella, who gave me an encouraging nod. The urge to scream the truth nearly overwhelmed me, but something instinct perhaps warned me to play along. "No, Father," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I don't think I can find the words today." Isabella stepped forward smoothly. "I'll speak instead," she offered, dabbing at non-existent tears. "For both of us." As she delivered a moving eulogy about my son, her husband of 3 years, I slipped away to the restroom, hands shaking as I typed a response to Mateo's number. "Where are you? What's happening?" The reply came immediately. "Can't explain now. They're watching. Meet me at the old Miller farm tomorrow, 3 p.m. Come alone. Don't trust Isabella." I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed older than her 67 years, with new lines of worry etched around her eyes. For a moment, I wondered if grief was making me hallucinate, creating impossible hope from despair. But the message had come from Mateo's phone, and who else would know about the Miller farm? When I returned to the viewing room, Isabella was concluding her tearful speech. "And though he's gone too soon, Mateo will live forever in our hearts." The mourners nodded solemnly. I took my place beside Isabella, forcing my face into a mask of grief while my mind whirled with questions and possibilities. If Mateo was alive, he must be in terrible danger to go to such extremes. And if these people were dangerous enough to fake his death, confronting Isabella publicly could put us both at risk. Instead, I patted her hand and whispered, "That was beautiful, dear. We'll get through this together." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. After the service, mourners gathered at my modest home for the reception. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, accepting condolences and casseroles, watching Isabella work the room with effortless charm. She was particularly attentive to Mateo's colleagues from the accounting firm, especially the senior partners who had taken him under their wing. "Carmen," Isabella's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "Mr. Davis was asking about Mateo's life insurance policy. I told him we'd discuss the details another time." Mr. Davis? A silver-haired man I'd never met. Nodded solemnly. Of course. Just letting you know the firm provides assistance with these matters for employees' families." "Thank you," I replied automatically, noting the calculating look that passed between Isabella and this stranger. "That's very thoughtful." As the evening wore on, I found myself watching Isabella through new eyes, the way she kept careful track of who attended, the hushed conversations in corners with people I didn't recognize, the frequent checks of her expensive watch, a gift from Mateo that had cost him 3 months' salary. By the time the last guest left, it was past midnight. Isabella insisted on staying with me for support, though her new condo was just 20 minutes away. "You shouldn't be alone tonight, Carmen," she said, her voice honey-sweet with concern. "I'll take the guest room." I couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. "Thank you, dear. I appreciate the company." That night, I lay awake in my bed, listening to the sounds of Isabella moving around the guest room. Every creak of the floorboards, every soft footfall outside my door set my nerves on edge. If my son was alive and in hiding, what danger was he facing? And more importantly, was that danger currently sleeping under my roof? 2 weeks before the funeral, Mateo had called me excited about a new business venture. "Mom, Isabella and I are going into real estate development. We found this incredible opportunity in Florida." His voice had an edge of excitement I hadn't heard in years, though something about it seemed forced, almost desperate. "Just be careful, sweetheart," I'd cautioned, that motherly instinct prickling. "These investment schemes can be risky." "It's not a scheme, Mom," he'd replied, a hint of irritation in his voice. "This is legitimate, big money, life-changing money." Then, more softly, "Isabella's really good with numbers. She's figured it all out." A week later, I received the call every parent dreads. Isabella, sobbing hysterically, told me Mateo had been killed in a car accident. The vehicle had caught fire, she claimed, leaving his body badly burned and difficult to identify. "I can't bear for you to see him like that," she'd wailed into the phone. "Please, Carmen, let me protect you from this horror." Something about her performance felt rehearsed, but grief makes you question your own instincts. I'd buried my husband 20 years earlier. I knew how shock could make people behave strangely. So, I'd agreed to the closed casket against every fiber of my being. But now, standing at my son's funeral with his impossible text message, I realized my instincts had been screaming warnings I'd chosen to ignore. The woman weeping dramatically beside me wasn't a grieving widow. She was an actress putting on the performance of her life. And apparently, my son was very much alive. Morning came with the sound of Isabella moving about the kitchen. I found her preparing coffee, already dressed immaculately in a black pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly pension. "I made you toast," she said, gesturing to a plate on the table. "You need to keep your strength up. There's so much paperwork to handle after, well, you know." I murmured my thanks and sat down, watching her over the rim of my coffee cup. In the harsh morning light, I noticed things I'd missed before the calculating glint in her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. The way her grief seemed to switch on and off depending on who was in the room. "I thought we might go through some of Mateo's papers today," she suggested casually. "There are insurance forms that need your signature as his next of kin." "Of course," I replied, matching her casual tone. "But I have a doctor's appointment this afternoon. Routine checkup." The lie came easily, surprising me. In 42 years of teaching, I'd become adept at spotting deception in teenagers. Now I was employing those same skills from the other side. "I can reschedule if you need me," I added, watching her reaction. No, Isabella said quickly. "Your health comes first. We can do the paperwork tonight." I nodded, noting how easily she'd accepted my excuse. If she truly believed I was grieving for my only child, wouldn't she have offered to accompany me? Or at least shown more concern after breakfast? Isabella left to make arrangements with the funeral home about the ashes. The moment her car disappeared down the street, I began preparations for my meeting with Mateo. The Miller farm was where Mateo used to take his high school dates, thinking I didn't know. It had been abandoned for years, sitting on 20 acres of overgrown land about 15 miles outside town. If someone wanted to meet secretly, it was the perfect spot, remote, forgotten, with multiple exit routes through the back fields. I packed a small bag with water bottles, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. Then, on impulse, I retrieved the old .38 revolver Miguel had left behind. I hadn't fired it in 20 years, but I remembered how. After checking that it was loaded, I tucked it into my purse alongside my phone and wallet. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed threatening. What had Mateo gotten himself into? Was he really in danger, or was this some elaborate scheme he and Isabella were running together? The rational part of my mind said the text could be fake, that grief was making me grasp at impossible hopes. But the message had come from Mateo's phone. And who else would know about the Miller farm I'd raised Mateo alone after Miguel left us? It wasn't the life I'd planned, but we'd made it work. Those early years were difficult teaching all day, grading papers late into the night while Mateo slept in the small apartment we called home. I'd scrimp and save to make sure he never missed out on school trips or baseball equipment. Somehow, we'd built a good life together. Mateo had been such a sensitive child, always with his nose in a book. Much like me, he'd grown into a thoughtful, kind young man who called me every Sunday without fail, even after he moved out to attend college on scholarship. When he landed his job at Davis & Hoffman Accounting, I'd never been prouder. My boy, the first college graduate in our family, working at a prestigious firm. Then came Isabella. They'd met at a client's charity gala 3 years ago. Isabella Rodriguez, beautiful, accomplished, 10 years older than most of the young women Mateo usually dated. Their whirlwind romance had concerned me from the start, but I'd bitten my tongue. After all, Mateo was 32, certainly old enough to make his own decisions. "She's different, Mom," he'd told me, eyes bright with infatuation. "She understands ambition. She's helping me network with the right people." The warning signs had been there from the beginning. The way Isabella would interrupt Mateo mid-sentence to clarify what he meant. The subtle criticisms of his clothes, his friends, his modest career goals. The way family gatherings became increasingly rare. "We're just so busy with Isabella's work contacts," Mateo would explain apologetically over the phone. "Maybe next weekend." Next weekend never seemed to come. Their wedding was small and elegant, Isabella's choice. She'd claimed it was to save money, yet somehow found funds for her designer gown and exclusive venue. I'd written a sizable check as my gift to them, nearly depleting my modest savings, but Isabella had barely acknowledged it. After the honeymoon, the distance grew. Sunday calls became monthly, then sporadic. When we did see each other, Mateo seemed different, more reserved, less likely to share his thoughts. Isabella was always there, monitoring our conversations, steering topics away from anything too personal. "Mateo's working so hard on this new certification," she'd explain when I asked why he seemed tired. "I'm just making sure he stays focused." The next afternoon, I drove my old Honda down the dirt road leading to the abandoned farmhouse, my heart hammering against my ribs. If Mateo was alive, why fake his death if he was in trouble? Why not come to me for help? The Miller farm looked even more decrepit than I remembered. The main house sagged on its foundation, windows broken, porch steps rotted through. The barn leaned dangerously to one side, its red paint long faded to a dusty pink. I parked behind the barn, out of sight from the main road, and waited. At exactly 3:00 p.m., I saw a figure emerge from the tree line at the edge of the property. Even from a distance, I recognized the walk, the way he held his shoulders. It was my son, very much alive. Mateo ran to my car as I stepped out, pulling me into a fierce hug that confirmed what my heart already knew. This was real. My boy was breathing, warm, alive. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he whispered into my hair. I never wanted you to go through that funeral, but I had to make sure you were safe first. Safe from what? I pulled back to look at his face, searching for answers. His eyes were haunted, older than they'd been just weeks ago. From the people Isabella's been working with. His voice dropped even lower. Mom, I think they want to kill me for real. We sat in his truck behind the old barn while Mateo explained how his perfect marriage had become a nightmare. Isabella hadn't just married him for love. She'd married him for access to something much more valuable than his accountant's salary. Remember when Abuelo Joe died and left you that property in Colorado? Mateo asked. I nodded. My father had owned 40 acres of what everyone thought was worthless mountain land. I'd never even seen it, just paid the property taxes every year out of habit. Isabella had it surveyed without telling either of us, Mateo continued, his voice tight with anger. Turns out there's a natural gas reserve underneath it worth millions. Maybe tens of millions. My breath caught in my throat. Millions? Yes. That land you've been paying taxes on for decades is worth a fortune. But the land is in my name, I said, confused. Was in your name? Mateo's jaw tightened. Remember those papers you signed last month? The ones Isabella said were for my life insurance beneficiary updates. My blood went cold. I'd trusted my daughter-in-law when she'd brought me a stack of legal documents, explaining that Mateo wanted to make sure everything was in order for our family's financial security. I'd signed without reading carefully because I trusted her. She forged some of the paperwork, Mateo continued. Made it look like you were transferring the property to me as part of estate planning. Then she had me sign papers that would make her the sole heir if anything happened to me. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. So if you're dead, she owns land worth millions. Exactly. But here's where it gets worse. The people she's working with aren't just paper pushers. Mom, they're criminals. They've done this before to other families, targeting older people with valuable assets they don't know they have. I felt that familiar surge of protective anger I'd experienced throughout Mateo's childhood. Nobody threatened my boy and got away with it. How did you find out? I overheard a phone call. Isabella was talking to someone about how they'd handle my accident. She was planning the funeral arrangements before I was supposed to be dead. He shuddered. I realized I had maybe hours before they made their move. So you disappeared. I had to, but I also had to make sure they thought their plan worked, at least temporarily. If they knew I was alive, they might come after you to force me out of hiding. I studied my son's face, seeing the man he'd become under pressure. Whose body is in that casket? Mateo. Nobody's. It's weighted with sandbags. I figured if I could buy enough time, maybe I could find evidence to stop them. He looked at me with desperate hope. Mom, I need your help. These people are serious, and I can't fight them alone. For 40 years, I'd protected this boy from scraped knees, broken hearts, and teenage mistakes. Now he needed me to help him survive something far more dangerous. The teacher in me wanted to march him straight to the police, but the mother in me recognized the fear in his eyes was real. What do you need me to do? Mateo's relief was palpable. First, we need to get you somewhere safe. Then we need to figure out how to expose what Isabella's really doing before she realizes I'm not actually dead. As if summoned by his words, my phone buzzed with a text from Isabella. Carmen, can you come over tonight? There are some of Mateo's business papers I need to go over with you. The trap was already closing, but now we knew it was coming. I have a plan, I told Mateo, showing him the message. But you need to stay hidden. These people think they're dealing with a grieving old woman who'll sign anything they put in front of her. Let's use that to our advantage. I agreed to meet Isabella that evening, playing the role of grieving mother-in-law while my very much alive son hid in the abandoned farmhouse. The plan was simple: get evidence of her scheme while she still believed I was an easy target. Isabella and Mateo lived in a modest 2-story house that I'd helped them buy with a down payment gift 2 years ago. Another investment in my son's happiness that had apparently been part of a longer con. Thank you for coming, Isabella said, greeting me at the door with red-rimmed eyes and a trembling voice. Oscar-worthy performance, truly. She led me to the kitchen table where she'd spread out various documents. I know this is difficult, but we need to start thinking about Mateo's estate. There are some assets that need to be transferred. and I wanted to make sure you understood everything. I put on my reading glasses and examined the papers, recognizing some from the stack I'd signed the month before. Others were new, including what appeared to be a power of attorney form giving Isabella control over my Colorado property. I don't understand, I said, channeling my inner confused elderly woman. Why would Mateo's estate need anything to do with my land? Isabella's mask slipped for just a moment, a flash of irritation crossing her features before the grieving widow returned. Mateo was handling your estate planning. Remember, he wanted to make sure everything would be simple for you as you get older. The condescension in her voice made my teeth clench, but I forced myself to appear grateful. That's so thoughtful, but I'm not that old, dear. I can still manage my own affairs. Of course you can, she said quickly. But Mateo worried about you living alone, especially after that fall you had last winter. I'd slipped on ice and bruised my hip, hardly a sign of declining mental capacity. But I could see how they'd been building a narrative about my supposed fragility, probably for months. Well, if Mateo thought it was best, I reached for a pen, then paused as if confused. But why does this paper say the property is worth $12 million? My father's old land isn't worth anything. Isabella's pupils dilated slightly. That's just a placeholder number for insurance purposes. Legal documents require estimated values. I nodded as if that made perfect sense, then deliberately knocked over my water glass, soaking the papers. Oh no, I'm so clumsy. While Isabella rushed to get towels, I quickly took photos of the soggy documents with my phone. When she returned, I was dabbing helplessly at the mess. I'm so sorry, dear. Should we do this another day? No, it's fine, Isabella said, but I could see the frustration she was trying to hide. I have copies. Why don't we just focus on the property transfer tonight? We can handle the rest later. She produced a fresh copy of the power of attorney document, and I pretended to read it carefully while actually studying her face. There was something predatory in her expression when she thought I wasn't looking, like a cat watching a mouse. Will this help with taxes? I asked innocently. Absolutely. It'll save you thousands. She leaned forward eagerly. All you need to do is sign right here. I picked up the pen, then set it down again. You know, I think I should have my lawyer look at this first. Mateo always said never to sign legal documents without professional advice. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Isabella's smile became strained, almost grotesque. Carmen, I am family. You can trust me. And the longer we wait, the more complicated the tax situation becomes. Something in her tone made my survival instincts kick into high gear. This wasn't just about money anymore. I was looking at a woman who would do whatever it took to get what she wanted, including eliminating obstacles. I'm sure you understand, dear. It's just good practice. I stood up, gathering my purse. I'll call my attorney tomorrow. Isabella's composure finally cracked. Sit down, Carmen. We're not finished here. The grieving widow was gone, replaced by something much more dangerous. And I realized my son hadn't been paranoid at all. The drive back to my house felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. Every car that followed too closely, every shadow that seemed out of place made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was convinced Isabella had already figured out that I knew too much. I was right. 3 men were waiting in my living room when I walked through the front door. They weren't trying to hide their presence. They'd turned on my lamps and made themselves comfortable on my furniture, like they owned the place. Mrs. Perez, said the one sitting in my late husband's recliner, a man in his 50s with the kind of face you'd forget immediately if you weren't terrified of it. We need to talk. My teacher instincts kicked in the same calm authority I'd used to control unruly teenagers for 4 decades. I don't recall inviting anyone into my home. You'll need to leave immediately. The man smiled, and it was worse than if he'd threatened me outright. I'm afraid we can't do that just yet. See, there's been some confusion about your son's business affairs, and we need to clear it up. My son is dead, I said flatly. Whatever business he had died with him. That's the thing, Mrs. Perez. The second man, younger with cold eyes, pulled out his phone and showed me a grainy photo of Mateo taken that afternoon near the Miller farm. Because this was taken about 3 hours ago. I stared at the photo, my mind racing. How had they found him so quickly? I don't know what kind of sick game you're playing, but no games, Mrs. Perez. The man in the recliner interrupted. Your son owes us money, a lot of money, and since he's decided to play dead instead of paying up, we're going to have to collect from his next of kin. The third man, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. One way or another, we're getting what we're owed. They knew about the land, which meant Isabella had already told them everything. Probably before Mateo's supposed death, this whole elaborate scheme was falling apart, and they were moving to Plan B. How much money are we talking about? I asked, playing for time while trying to figure out how to warn Mateo. 2.5 million plus interest, the man in the recliner replied. Your boy made some very poor investment choices with our money. The number hit me like a punch to the stomach. Even if the land was worth what they claimed, there was no way I could liquidate it quickly enough to save Mateo's life. I don't have that kind of money, I said honestly. But you have land worth 10 times that amount. The first man responded smoothly. Sign it over to us, and your son's debt is forgiven. He can even come home and pretend to rise from the dead. Very biblical. The man in my husband's chair leaned forward. Or you can keep protecting him, and we'll find him eventually anyway. But then we'll collect the money and make sure he never bothers us again along with anyone who helped him hide. The threat was crystal clear. They'd kill us both if I didn't cooperate. I need time to think about this, I said. You have until tomorrow night. Isabella will bring you the papers. He stood up, straightening his jacket. Make the right choice, Mrs. Perez, for both your sakes. They left as casually as they'd arrived, and I stood in my violated living room, shaking with rage and fear. 43 years of marriage, 20 years of widowhood. And nobody had ever made me feel this helpless in my own home. But helpless and defeated were two different things. I'd been underestimated my entire life because I was a woman, because I was a teacher, because I was polite and accommodating. These men had just made the same mistake. They had no idea what a mother would do to protect her child. I drove back to the Miller farm through back roads, checking my mirrors constantly and taking a deliberately confusing route to make sure I wasn't followed. Mateo was waiting for me in the old farmhouse, pacing like a caged animal. They found you, I said without preamble. They have photos of you here. His face went white. How is that possible? I've been so careful. Doesn't matter now. They gave me an ultimatum. Sign over the Colorado land by tomorrow night or they kill us both. I sat down on a dusty crate, suddenly feeling every one of my 67 years. Mateo, how did you end up owing $2.5 million to these people? He ran his hands through his hair, looking younger and more vulnerable than he had since he was a teenager caught sneaking out of the house. It started small. Mom, Isabella said she'd found some investment opportunities that could make us rich quickly. Private loans with huge returns. Let me guess. You needed seed money to get started. Exactly. First it was $10,000, then $25,000. The returns were incredible at first, enough to pay back the loans and have money left over. His voice was bitter with self-recrimination. I should have known it was too good to be true. What happened? The whole thing was a Ponzi scheme. When it collapsed, everyone who'd borrowed money to invest was left holding the debt. But our loans weren't from banks. Mom, they were from the kind of people who break legs when you can't pay. I thought about the 3 men who'd invaded my home, their casual confidence that violence was always an option. And Isabella knew this when she suggested the investments. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Either she's the dumbest person alive or she's been setting me up from the beginning. Mateo had always been too trusting, a quality I'd normally cherish in my son. But Isabella had taken advantage of his good nature from the start. As we talked, a clearer picture of her deception emerged. Tell me about Isabella's background, I said. The real story, not the version she told us. Mateo leaned against the wall, his face troubled. After I found out about the Colorado property, I started digging. Her parents weren't wealthy real estate developers in Phoenix. They were small-time con artists who moved from city to city, staying one step ahead of their victims. She grew up in that world. He nodded. From what I could piece together, they lived in motels, constantly changing schools. Her father went to prison when she was 15, and her mother abandoned her soon after. She spent 3 years in foster care before aging out of the system. My teacher's heart ached for the child Isabella had been, even as I despised the woman she'd become. A lifetime of insecurity and survival had twisted her into someone who saw people as marks rather than human beings. That's why she's so obsessed with money and status, Mateo continued. She grew up with nothing, terrified of going back to that life. When she met me at that charity event, she wasn't there as a guest. She was working as a server, scouting for potential targets. And you were perfect, I said softly. Young, successful, kind. And with a mother who owned valuable property she didn't even know about. His voice was hollow. Isabella didn't love me. Mom, she had a long con planned from our first date. I remembered how quickly Isabella had pushed for marriage, how she'd isolated Mateo from his friends, how she'd taken control of their finances despite Mateo's accounting degree. The signs had been there all along. How did she find out about the Colorado land, I asked. Your grandfather never thought it was worth anything. She had access to my computer where I kept digital copies of all our family documents. She must have run property searches on everything in our names. Mateo shook his head. One night, about 6 months ago, I overheard her on the phone talking about mineral rights and survey reports. When I asked her about it, she claimed it was for a client. And the gas deposits, how did she discover those? She's been working with a man named Miguel Delgado for at least a year. He runs a company that identifies properties with untapped resources, then finds ways to acquire them cheaply. Mateo's expression darkened. Usually by targeting elderly owners who don't understand what they have. The name clicked immediately. Miguel Delgado was in my house tonight, the one sitting in your father's chair. Mateo's eyes widened. He's dangerous. Mom, ex-military turned mercenary before he got into this scheme. The other men are probably Vasquez and Torres, his enforcers. I felt cold despite the warm evening. These aren't just white-collar criminals, are they? No, they've done this before. I found files on Isabella's laptop. At least 4 other cases where elderly property owners mysteriously died or were declared mentally incompetent after refusing to sell. Their children or spouses inherited, then quickly sold to shell companies owned by Delgado. And Isabella has been part of this operation all along, I said, the full horror dawning on me. She married you to gain access to our family. Mateo looked away, ashamed. She knew exactly who to target. Mom, a Latino accountant from a modest background, raised by a single mother who taught high school. She calculated that we'd have family land somewhere most immigrant families try to buy property as soon as they can. And she knew I'd be the type to take care of my mother's finances as you got older. I reached out to squeeze his hand. This isn't your fault. Mateo, she's a professional manipulator. But I should have seen through her. All those times she insisted on handling our investments despite my financial training. The way she always changed the subject when I asked about returns or documentation. His voice cracked. I was so blind. What pushed you to investigate? I asked. Last month, I found withdrawal slips for large amounts from our joint account. When I confronted her, Isabella claimed she was preparing a second honeymoon to celebrate our anniversary. It sounded plausible, but something felt off. He took a deep breath. Then I overheard that phone call about my accident. She was in our home office with the door nearly closed, speaking softly. Once the accident happens, we'll have 90 days to complete the transfer. The mother won't be a problem, she trusts me completely. I shuddered at the cold calculation in those words. That night, I pretended everything was normal. The next morning, I withdrew $5,000 cash, our emergency fund, and disappeared. I've been moving between motels in this place ever since, trying to gather evidence. He looked at me with desperate eyes. What are we going to do, Mom? These people are serious. I thought about the 3 men in my living room, making threats with casual confidence. The way Isabella's mask had slipped when I refused to sign the papers. We're going to give them exactly what they want, I said, a plan forming in my mind. The Colorado property. Mateo's shoulders sagged with relief and defeat. Mom, I can't let you sacrifice everything for my mistakes. Who said anything about sacrifice? I smiled, feeling more like myself than I had in days. Sweetheart, you're assuming that land is the only card we have to play. But you're forgetting something important. What's that? I've been a high school English teacher for 42 years. I've dealt with bullies, liars, and manipulators who thought they were smarter than everyone else. I stood up, brushing dust off my clothes. These people think they're dealing with a frightened old woman who will do anything to save her son. They have no idea they just picked a fight with someone who spent 4 decades outsmarting teenagers. Mateo looked confused but hopeful. What's your plan? First, we're going to make sure you're somewhere truly safe. Then, I'm going to give Isabella and her friends a lesson they'll never forget. I checked my watch. But we need to move fast. I have papers to sign tomorrow night, and I want to make sure those papers say exactly what I want them to say. Mom, these aren't high school kids trying to cheat on a test. These people are dangerous. I thought about the man sitting in my husband's chair, making threats in my own living room. The fury I'd been holding back all day crystallized into something cold and sharp. So am I, sweetheart. They just don't know it yet. We spent the next hour formulating a plan. Mateo couldn't return to any of his usual hideouts. The photo proved they were watching the farm, and his motels might be compromised too. He needed somewhere they'd never think to look. What about Mrs. Alvarez? I suggested. She still lives next door to me, and she adores you. Her basement apartment has a separate entrance from the backyard. Wouldn't that put her in danger too? Not if they believe you fled the state. Besides, it's the last place they'd look literally right under their noses. After a quick call, Mrs. Alvarez agreed without hesitation. She'd known Mateo since he was a boy and hadn't believed the accident story from the start. Something wasn't right about that wife of his, she'd muttered. Too perfect, like a doll with nothing inside. With Mateo's safety arranged, we turned to the heart of the problem, the money and the land. I need to understand exactly how this investment scheme worked, I said. Start from the beginning. Mateo explained how Isabella had introduced him to exclusive investment opportunities shortly after their wedding. The initial investments were small $5,000 here, $10,000 there, with impressive returns that arrived like clockwork. The early payouts were real, he explained. That's how Ponzi schemes work. They use new investors' money to pay returns to earlier investors, creating the illusion of legitimate profits. And the $2.5 million they claim you owe, Mateo's expression darkened. About 6 months ago, Isabella convinced me to leverage our house and savings for a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. She said her contact had exclusive access to pre-IPO shares in a tech company that was about to go public. The potential return was enormous enough to retire young. But there was no tech company, I guessed. Exactly. The money disappeared into accounts controlled by Delgado. When I started asking questions about documentation and returns, Isabella stalled. Then came the threats, subtle at first, then increasingly direct. My contacts are not people you want to disappoint, she'd say. A terrible thought occurred to me. Mateo, were you actually planning to invest my Colorado property too? He looked ashamed. Isabella had been pushing for it. She said we could use it as collateral for an even bigger investment. I kept refusing. It was your land, not mine to risk. That's when the accident plan started. So she couldn't convince you to use my property, and they decided to eliminate you to get it another way. The cold calculation was breathtaking. What happened to the other investors in this scheme? Most lost everything, but quietly. These were wealthy people who didn't want the embarrassment of admitting they'd been conned. But there was one man, Dr. Jensen, who threatened to go to the authorities. He had documentation, recordings of conversations with Delgado. Mateo swallowed hard. He died in a home invasion 2 weeks later. Police called it a robbery gone wrong, but nothing valuable was taken except his computer and files. I felt sick. We're dealing with killers, not just con artists. That's why I had to disappear. Mom, when I found out what they were planning, I knew they wouldn't stop at just me. Once they had the property, you'd become a liability too. And the photos they showed me. They must have surveillance on the farm. I thought I was being careful. He ran a hand through his hair. I've been trying to gather evidence against them, but it's scattered across different accounts and devices. Isabella has most of the documentation for the investments on her laptop, but it's password protected and never leaves her sight. I thought about the Isabella I'd observed at the funeral, and in her home always checking her phone, keeping her designer handbag close. The laptop was likely there, protected but accessible. Tell me more about Delgado's operation, I said. How many people are involved? From what I've pieced together, it's surprisingly small. Delgado runs everything identifies properties, recruits people like Isabella to target owners, and handles the money. Vasquez and Torres are his muscle. There's also a lawyer who creates the fake documentation and a banker who helps move the money offshore. What about the other victims? Have you contacted any of them? Mateo shook his head. Too risky. Many don't even realize they've been targeted specifically. The investment scheme looks legitimate. On the surface, losses can be blamed on market volatility or bad luck. And those who do suspect foul play are too afraid to speak up after what happened to Jensen. I absorbed this information, thinking about the next steps. We need evidence. Mateo, hard evidence that links Delgado, Isabella, and the others to both the investment fraud and the threats against you. How Isabella's laptop has everything, but we can't get to it. Maybe we don't need to. An idea was forming, risky, but potentially effective. What if we could get them to incriminate themselves, create a situation where they admit their plans, believing they've already won? Mateo looked skeptical. These people are professionals. Mom, they're not going to just confess because we ask nicely. No, but people who think they've won often become careless, arrogant. I smiled grimly. I've seen it countless times with students who thought they'd gotten away with cheating. The moment they believe they're safe, they start bragging. I checked my watch. Almost midnight. I need to make a phone call, but not from either of our phones. They're probably monitoring them. Use Mrs. Alvarez's landline when we get there. Who are you calling? An old student of mine, Robert Judge. He's a criminal defense attorney now, but he still owes me for not failing him senior year when he plagiarized his term paper. For the first time since this nightmare began, Mateo smiled a flash of the boy I'd raised. You're really going to fight them, aren't you? With everything I've got, I promised. No one threatens my family and gets away with it. As we prepared to leave the farm, Mateo hesitated. Mom, there's something else you should know about Isabella. I paused, sensing his discomfort. What is it, the reason she targeted me specifically? He took a deep breath. She knew about Abuelo's property because she'd researched our family thoroughly. She'd been watching me for months before we coincidentally met at that charity event. The calculated nature of her deception was staggering. How do you know this? I found a file on her laptop background research on potential targets. Mine included details about you, your teaching career, even old newspaper clippings about Abuelo buying the Colorado land in the 1970s. She knew everything about us before she ever said hello. The violation felt personal and profound. Isabella hadn't just married my son under false pretenses. She'd studied our lives, our history, our vulnerabilities, all to exploit us. She will pay for this, I said quietly. Not just for the money or the threats, but for making a mockery of our family. As we drove away from the farm through back roads, I glanced at Mateo in the passenger seat. The pain in his eyes was more than financial. It was the deep wound of betrayal by someone he'd loved and trusted. What am I supposed to do now? He asked softly. How do I trust anyone again? It was the question every parent dreads the moment when you realize your child's innocence is truly gone. But it was also an opportunity to help him find strength he didn't know he had. You learn to trust yourself first, I said. You learn to recognize red flags, to ask questions, to verify things that seem too good to be true. But you don't let fear keep you from connecting with people who deserve your trust. Mateo smiled for the first time since this nightmare began. Like my mom, who turns out to be a criminal mastermind when I needed her to be. I prefer strategically gifted, I replied. And I learned from watching you, actually the way you protected me by disappearing. The courage it took to fake your death when you realized how dangerous these people were. You're braver than you think. By the time we reached Mrs. Alvarez's house, we had the outline of a plan dangerous and uncertain, but better than surrendering to Delgado's demands. Mateo would remain hidden while I set a trap that would give us both the evidence and leverage we needed. These criminals had no idea who they were dealing with. They saw an aging Spanish teacher, a vulnerable widow they could easily manipulate. They failed to recognize that 4 decades of managing classrooms filled with teenagers had taught me more about handling manipulators and liars than any criminal ever knew. Tomorrow, Isabella and her friends would learn exactly how dangerous I could be. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 20 years. I called in sick to my volunteer work at the library and drove to the city to meet with the one person who could help me turn this disaster into justice served. Robert Judge had been my lawyer since my husband died. But more importantly, he'd been my student 30 years ago when he was a rebellious teenager trying to coast through senior English. Now he ran one of the most respected criminal defense firms in the state, and he still owed me a favor for not flunking him when he deserved it. "Carmen Perez," he said, standing up from his mahogany desk with a genuine smile. "You look exactly the same as when you were terrorizing us with Shakespeare." "I prefer educating with enthusiasm," I replied, accepting his hug. "Robert, I need your help with something unusual." I laid out the entire story, watching his expression shift from amusement to concern to fascination as I described Isabella's scheme, the fake funeral, and the threats from Mateo's creditors. "Let me make sure I understand," Robert said, leaning back in his leather chair. "Your daughter-in-law forged documents to steal your mineral rights. Your son faked his death to avoid loan sharks, and now said loan sharks are threatening to kill you both unless you sign over property worth millions. That's the basic situation, yes. Carmen, you're describing multiple felonies here: fraud, extortion, conspiracy, possibly kidnapping if they're holding you under duress." He pulled out a legal pad. "The smart thing would be to call the FBI right now and have my son arrested for fraud, have him spend years in prison while these criminals disappear into the wind." I shook my head. There has to be another way. Robert studied me with the same look he'd given me when I handed back his failed midterm exam senior year. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I want to give them what they want, but on my terms. Can you draw up documents that look legitimate, but contain legal landmines they won't notice until it's too late? You want to set a trap. I want to give them enough rope to hang themselves while protecting Mateo and recovering what they stole from other families." I leaned forward. "Robert, these people have done this before. How many other seniors have lost everything because someone trusted the wrong person?" He was quiet for a long moment, then smiled with an expression I remembered from the day he'd finally understood the meaning behind Hamlet's revenge plot. "What did you have in mind?" 3 hours later, I left Robert's office with a briefcase full of legal documents that looked exactly like what Isabella and her criminal friends expected, but contained enough hidden clauses to ensure they'd be confessing to multiple felonies the moment they signed them. The papers transferred ownership of my Colorado property to a newly created trust with Isabella as the designated trustee. What they wouldn't realize until it was too late was that the trust documents included automatic provisions requiring any trustee to report all previous fraudulent activities to federal authorities, and that accepting the position constituted a legal confession to any crimes committed in pursuit of the property. "It's diabolical," Robert had said admiringly. "If they don't sign, they don't get the property. If they do sign, they've legally confessed to everything and triggered federal jurisdiction." "I learned from the best," I'd replied. "Shakespeare knew a thing or two about people who think they're smarter than everyone else." Now I was back home, waiting for Isabella's call and trying to look like a frightened old woman instead of someone who just spent the day outmaneuvering criminals with decades more experience than a retired English teacher. My phone rang at exactly 7:00 p.m. "Carmen," Isabella's voice was clipped, businesslike. The grieving widow act was apparently over. "I have the papers ready. I'll be over in an hour. Actually, dear, could we meet somewhere else? Having people in the house so soon after Mateo's funeral feels overwhelming." A pause. "Where did you have in mind the Riverside Diner? It's public, well lit, and they have excellent pie." I made my voice slightly shaky. "I could use the comfort of familiar surroundings," Isabella agreed, probably thinking a public location would prevent me from making a scene. She had no idea I was counting on witnesses for what came next. The Riverside Diner had been serving the best coffee and apple pie in our small town for 40 years. More importantly, it was where Sheriff Tom Bradley ate dinner every Tuesday night, where Prosecutor Janet Morrison met her book club, and where half the town council gathered to gossip about local politics. In other words, it was exactly where you'd want to be when you needed credible witnesses to watch criminals incriminate themselves. I arrived early, claiming my usual booth in the back corner where I could see the entire restaurant. Sheriff Bradley was at his regular table, working through a plate of meatloaf while reading reports. Perfect. Isabella arrived precisely on time, accompanied by the man who'd been sitting in my husband's chair the night before. She introduced him as Miguel, Mateo's business partner. But I could see the calculation in his eyes as he scanned the room, noting the sheriff's presence. "I thought this was going to be private," Miguel said, sliding into the booth across from me. "It is private," I replied mildly. "No one's paying attention to us." Isabella set a manila folder on the table. "These are the documents we discussed: the property transfer, some insurance paperwork, and a few other items that need your signature." I opened the folder, recognizing the legitimate-looking forgeries that would have destroyed my life if I had signed them yesterday. Instead, I pushed them aside and pulled out my briefcase. "Actually, I had my lawyer prepare something more comprehensive," I said, setting Robert's documents on the table. "I want to make sure everything is done properly." Miguel's expression shifted to wariness. "Your lawyer. Robert Judge. He's very thorough." I smiled blandly. He made sure these documents protect everyone's interests. For the next 20 minutes, I watched them review papers that looked exactly like what they wanted, but contained legal poison pills in every paragraph. Robert had been brilliant, using technical language that obscured the document's true purpose while making them appear favorable to Isabella and her associates. "This seems more complicated than necessary," Isabella said, flipping through pages of dense legal text. "Well, dear, when you're dealing with millions of dollars, you can't be too careful." I signaled the waitress for more coffee. Robert insisted on including provisions to protect against any previous irregularities in the property's ownership history. Miguel looked up sharply. "What kind of irregularities?" "Oh, the usual concerns. Making sure there are no outstanding liens, no fraudulent transfers, no criminal activity associated with previous ownership changes." I kept my voice light and conversational. Standard legal protection. What I wasn't telling them was that by signing these documents, they'd be legally acknowledging that they were aware of previous criminal activity and accepting responsibility for reporting it to federal authorities. Robert had woven the confession requirements so cleverly into the property transfer language that they'd essentially be pleading guilty to multiple felonies. "I think we should have our lawyer review this first," Miguel said, starting to close the folder. "Of course," I agreed easily. Though I should mention, Robert said the property tax implications changed significantly after midnight tonight. Something about quarterly reporting requirements and federal oversight of high-value mineral rights transfers. It was complete nonsense, but it sounded official enough to create urgency. Isabella and Miguel exchanged glances. "What exactly happens after midnight?" Isabella asked. "The transfer becomes subject to additional federal scrutiny, which could delay processing for months. Robert said it's better to handle everything under the current regulations." I shrugged apologetically. "I don't pretend to understand all the legal technicalities." Miguel pulled out his phone, presumably to call their lawyer, but it was after 8:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. No legitimate attorney would be available for an emergency consultation about property transfers. As he stepped outside to make his call, Isabella leaned forward. "Carmen, I know this is difficult. Losing Mateo, now dealing with all this paperwork." Her voice dripped with false sympathy. "But it's what he would have wanted, making sure you're taken care of." I looked into the eyes of the woman who had planned my son's death, who had married him solely to access our family's assets, who had pretended to love him while plotting his destruction. In that moment, I felt a cold clarity that surprised me. "You know what Mateo would have wanted. Isabella, he would have wanted his wife to love him for who he was, not for what she could steal from his family." Her eyes widened fractionally, then narrowed. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? I kept my voice low. I know everything, Isabella, about the Ponzi scheme, about Delgado, about your plans for my son's accident. The only reason I'm sitting here instead of talking to the police is that I'm trying to protect Mateo. A flash of panic crossed her face before she controlled it. Mateo is dead. Carmen, you're obviously confused by grief. Am I? I sipped my coffee calmly. Then why did Miguel show me a photo of my very much alive son taken yesterday? Why are you threatening to kill us both if I don't sign over my property? Isabella's mask slipped completely, revealing the cold, calculating woman beneath. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Old woman. Sign the papers and maybe you both get to live. Refuse, and neither of you will see Christmas. That's quite a threat to make in a public place, I observed mildly, especially with the sheriff sitting right over there. Before she could respond, Miguel returned, his expression grim. Our lawyer isn't answering, but I've reviewed enough of this to see it's basically what we discussed. There's just a lot of extra legal language. Fine, Isabella said, her composure restored. Let's just sign and be done with it, for the next 30 minutes. I sat patiently while they read through documents that would destroy them, answering their questions with carefully rehearsed explanations that made the trap sound like standard legal protection. When they finally signed, I felt the same satisfaction I'd experienced watching difficult students finally grasp a complex literary concept. They had no idea they'd just confessed to everything. The moment Isabella and Miguel finished signing the documents, I excused myself to use the restroom, taking my briefcase with me. Instead of going to the ladies' room, I walked straight to Sheriff Bradley's table. Tom, I said quietly, sitting down across from him, I need to report multiple felonies, and I have written confessions from the perpetrators. To his credit, Sheriff Bradley set down his fork and gave me his full attention without questioning why Carmen Perez, retired English teacher and pillar of the community, was suddenly talking about criminal confessions. I quickly explained the situation while keeping one eye on Isabella and Miguel, who were still sitting in the booth, probably planning how to spend their millions. These people threatened to kill me and my son, I finished. They made their intentions very clear. I opened my briefcase and showed him the documents. My lawyer designed these papers so that by signing them, they've legally acknowledged their criminal activities and agreed to cooperate with federal authorities. Tom examined the papers, his 20 years of police experience evident in how quickly he grasped the legal implications. This is incredibly clever and completely legal. Completely. Robert made sure of that. I glanced toward the booth where Isabella was checking her watch impatiently. Tom, there's something else. My son isn't actually dead. That got his attention. Come again. Mateo faked his death to protect himself from these people. He's been hiding, but they found him anyway. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos I'd taken of the forged documents in Isabella's kitchen. I have evidence of the fraud, extortion, and conspiracy, and now I have their signed confessions. Sheriff Bradley was quiet for a moment, then smiled with genuine admiration. Carmen, in 30 years of police work, I've never seen a civilian conduct a more thorough criminal investigation. He stood up, straightening his uniform. Let me go have a conversation with your dinner companions. Wait, I put a hand on his arm. There's something else you should know. They have partners, other people involved in this scheme. If you arrest Isabella and Miguel now, the others might disappear. What are you suggesting? Give me 5 more minutes with them. Let me confirm the meeting location where they're supposed to deliver the signed documents to their bosses. I smiled. Then you can arrest everyone at once. Tom studied my face, probably wondering when the mild-mannered English teacher had turned into a master strategist. 5 minutes. But Carmen, if this goes sideways, it won't. I've been handling difficult people for 42 years. These criminals are just better dressed than my former students. I walked back to the booth where Isabella and Miguel were growing increasingly impatient. Sorry for the delay, I said, sliding back into my seat. Where do we go from here? Miguel relaxed slightly. We need to get these documents to our legal team tonight for final processing. There's a warehouse on Industrial Boulevard where we're meeting them. Tonight, the sooner we complete the transfer, the better, Isabella said. It's been such a difficult time. The practiced grief returned to her voice. I nodded sympathetically while mentally noting the location. Industrial Boulevard was perfect for a police raid, isolated enough that civilians wouldn't be at risk when the arrests went down. I suppose you'll need me there to verify my identity for the transfer. Actually, no, Miguel said quickly. Your signature on these documents is all we need. You can go home and try to get some rest. Of course, they didn't want me at the meeting. I was supposed to go home and wait quietly while they celebrated stealing millions from a grieving mother. Well then, I said, standing up and gathering my things. I guess this is goodbye. Isabella actually had the audacity to hug me. Thank you, Carmen. Mateo would be so proud of how strong you've been. As I walked out of the diner, I saw Sheriff Bradley finishing his dinner and preparing to follow me. In 30 minutes, Isabella and her criminal associates would discover that their victim had been hunting them all along. But first, I had a phone call to make. I called Mateo from my car in the diner parking lot, watching through the window as Sheriff Bradley made his own phone calls, presumably coordinating with state and federal authorities. Mom, Mateo's voice was tight with anxiety. How did it go? Better than expected. They signed everything, and Sheriff Bradley is coordinating arrests as we speak. I started my car, keeping my voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Sweetheart, I need you to stay exactly where you are until this is over. What about Isabella? Does she suspect anything? I thought about my daughter-in-law's performance, the fake grief, the casual threats, the way she'd manipulated both Mateo and me for months. She suspects I'm a frightened old woman who just signed away millions to save her son's life. She has no idea what actually happened. Mom, what if something goes wrong? What if they figure out the documents are traps before the police get there? It was a legitimate concern. Robert's legal landmines were sophisticated, but they weren't foolproof. If Isabella and Miguel had a lawyer review the documents before meeting with their partners, they might realize they'd been outmaneuvered. Then we'll deal with that problem when it happens, I said firmly. Mateo, I need you to understand something. What happened to you? What these people tried to do to our family. It's not your fault. Isabella targeted you specifically because you're decent and trusting. I should have been smarter. I should have seen through her. Sweetheart, I lived with your father for 23 years and thought I knew him completely. Sometimes the people closest to us are the hardest to see clearly. I pulled out of the diner parking lot, following the route that would take me past Industrial Boulevard. The important thing is that we're fixing it. 20 minutes later, I parked on a hill overlooking the warehouse district, close enough to see the activity, but far enough away to be safe. Sheriff Bradley had been thorough. I could see unmarked police cars positioned at every exit and what looked like federal agents in tactical gear surrounding the main building. My phone buzzed with a text from Robert. FBI confirms your documents triggered automatic federal jurisdiction. Whatever happens tonight, these people are going away for a very long time. At 10:47 p.m., I watched through binoculars as 3 cars converged on the warehouse Isabella and Miguel had mentioned. The first car contained Isabella and Miguel. The second held 2 men I recognized from my living room the night before. The third car held 2 people I didn't recognize, probably higher-level criminals who'd been running this operation from behind the scenes. They were inside the warehouse for exactly 12 minutes before the building was surrounded by law enforcement officers with floodlights and megaphones. This is the FBI. The building is surrounded. Exit through the front door with your hands visible. What followed was anticlimactic in the best possible way. No gunfights, no dramatic chase scenes. Just 6 criminals walking out of a warehouse with their hands in the air, realizing too late that they'd been outmaneuvered by a retired English teacher who'd been underestimated her entire life. My phone rang as the last suspect was loaded into a police car. Mrs. Perez. It was Sheriff Bradley. It's over. We got all of them, plus evidence of at least 12 other property fraud cases in 6 states. Your son can come home. I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding. What happens now? Now you and Mateo give statements. We process the evidence. And these people face federal charges for fraud, extortion, conspiracy, and criminal enterprise. His voice was warm with approval. Carmen, What you did tonight probably saved dozens of other families from becoming victims." As I drove home, I realized I felt different than I had this morning. Not just relieved, but powerful in a way I'd never experienced before. For 42 years, I'd shaped young minds and helped students find their strength. Tonight, I discovered my own. But there was still one more conversation I needed to have. Mateo was waiting on my front porch when I pulled into the driveway, and seeing him there in the light from my porch lamp, alive and safe and free, nearly brought me to my knees with relief. "Is it really over?" he asked, pulling me into a fierce hug. "It's over," I confirmed. "Isabella and her associates are in federal custody. The property is safe. You're safe." We went inside and I made coffee while Mateo sat at my kitchen table, looking older and wiser than he had just a week ago. The boy who'd trusted too easily was gone, replaced by a man who'd learned hard lessons about human nature. "Mom, I need to know something," he said as I set his favorite mug in front of him. "When did you figure out that Isabella was targeting me specifically?" I'd been thinking about that question myself. Honestly, not until I saw how quickly she moved after your supposed death. The grief was too perfect, too performed. But the real confirmation was when she brought those papers to my house. She knew exactly what she wanted and exactly how to manipulate me to get it. How long do you think she was planning this? Probably from the moment she met you. The truth was painful, but necessary. "Mateo, Isabella researched our family before your first date. She knew about my father's property. She knew I'd helped you buy your house. She knew I'd do anything to protect you." He was quiet for a long time, processing the betrayal. "So, our entire marriage was fake. Her feelings were fake. Yours were real. That matters. Does it?" I feel like such a fool. I reached across the table and took his hand. "Sweetheart, you fell in love with the person she pretended to be. That person was kind, supportive, and made you happy. The fact that it was an act doesn't diminish the genuine emotions you felt. What am I supposed to do now? How do I trust anyone again?" It was the question every parent dreads, the moment when you realize your child's innocence is truly gone. But it was also an opportunity to help him find strength he didn't know he had. "You learn to trust yourself first," I said. "You learn to recognize red flags, to ask questions, to verify things that seem too good to be true. But you don't let fear keep you from connecting with people who deserve your trust." Mateo smiled for the first time since this nightmare began. "Like my mom, who turned out to be a criminal mastermind when I needed her to be." "I prefer strategically gifted," I replied. "And I learned from watching you, actually the way you protected me by disappearing. The courage it took to fake your death when you realized how dangerous these people were. You're braver than you think. What happens now?" I looked around my kitchen, my house, my life that had been threatened and was now secure. "Now you move back home. We figure out what to do with mineral rights worth millions, and I go back to volunteering at the library. Except maybe I'll also help the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit identify seniors who might be vulnerable to these kinds of schemes. You want to keep fighting criminals? I want to keep protecting people who can't protect themselves. Turns out I'm good at it." 3 weeks later, I received a letter from the federal prosecutor handling Isabella's case. She and her associates had been charged with 23 felonies across 6 states, with evidence linking them to property fraud schemes targeting elderly victims nationwide. The FBI had recovered over $40 million in stolen assets. My testimony, combined with the ingenious confession documents Robert had designed, formed the backbone of a case that would likely send these people to prison for decades. But the real victory was simpler than justice or money. It was Mateo, healthy and whole, learning to trust again while building a life based on genuine relationships instead of manipulation. It was me discovering at 67 that I was far stronger and more capable than anyone had ever imagined. And it was the knowledge that sometimes when people underestimate you, that underestimation becomes the very weapon you need to protect everything you love. I was sorting through the mail one morning when I found an official-looking envelope from the Colorado Division of Natural Resources. Inside was a detailed report on the natural gas reserves under my father's property. along with several offers from energy companies interested in leasing the mineral rights. The lowest offer was for $15 million. The highest was nearly double that. I sat down at my kitchen table, staring at numbers that seemed impossible. All these years, I'd been paying property taxes on land I thought was worthless, never knowing I was sitting on a fortune. If Isabella hadn't been so greedy, so intent on stealing everything rather than negotiating honestly, she might have legitimately benefited from this discovery. Instead, she was facing 20 years in federal prison, along with Miguel Delgado and their associates. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Robert Judge. "Carmen, I just got word. Isabella is trying to make a deal with prosecutors. She's offering to testify against Delgado and the others in exchange for a reduced sentence. Will they accept it? Unlikely. The evidence we collected is overwhelming, and the FBI found records of at least 4 other victims who died under suspicious circumstances after refusing to sell their properties. Isabella was directly involved in 2 of those cases. I thought about the lives that had been destroyed by these people's greed, the families who had lost loved ones thinking it was just bad luck or tragic accidents. What happens to their other victims? I asked. The ones who already lost their properties. The FBI is working to trace the assets. In many cases, the properties can be returned to the original owners or their heirs. It's complicated legal territory, but they're committed to making it right. After we hung up, I sat on my porch swing, watching the neighborhood children play in the early summer evening. Mrs. Alvarez waved from her garden next door. Life was returning to normal, though normal now meant something very different. Mateo had moved into an apartment downtown, close to the FBI field office where he was now consulting on financial fraud cases targeting the elderly. He was still healing from Isabella's betrayal, but I saw glimpses of his old self returning his kindness, his humor, his capacity for joy. As for me, I discovered a strength I never knew I possessed. The Colorado property would eventually provide financial security beyond anything I could have imagined, but the real wealth was in knowing I could face the worst and emerge victorious. My phone buzzed with a text from Mateo. "Court date set for preliminary hearing. Are you ready for this?" I typed back. "More than ready. See you there." In the morning, I would face Isabella and her co-conspirators in court. I would look them in the eye and tell the truth about what they'd done to my family and to so many others. And I would do it without fear, because I now understood what they had failed to see, that a lifetime of being underestimated had prepared me perfectly to become their worst nightmare. The funeral had been fake, but my son's resurrection was beautifully, powerfully real. And my own rebirth as a force to be reckoned with was perhaps the greatest surprise of all. The federal courthouse was intimidating, all marble columns and solemn grandeur. I wore my best dress, the navy blue one I'd saved for special occasions, and held my head high as I walked up the steps with Mateo beside me. Inside, the courtroom was already filling with people. Some were reporters, drawn by the sensational nature of the case. Others were victims or family members of victims, their faces marked by the same mixture of grief and determination that I recognized in my own mirror. "Mrs. Perez," a woman in her 70s approached me in the hallway. "I'm Eleanor Jensen, David Jensen's widow." I immediately recognized the name. Dr. Jensen had been one of the investors who threatened to expose Delgado's scheme, only to die in a suspicious home invasion. "I'm so sorry about your husband," I said, taking her trembling hands in mine. "They said it was a random burglary," she replied, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "But David had been telling me for weeks that something wasn't right about his investments. When he died, I knew it wasn't random, but no one would listen." "They're listening now," Mateo said gently. Mrs. Jensen turned to him with a sad smile. "Your mother is extraordinary. What she did trapping them with their own greed, it's given all of us a chance for justice." I shook my head. "I just did what any mother would do to protect her child." "No," she insisted. "You did what a warrior would do, and you've given us all our voices back." Inside the courtroom, I saw Isabella for the first time since her arrest. She sat at the defense table in a modest gray suit, her previously perfect hair now pulled back in a simple ponytail. Without her designer clothes and carefully applied makeup, she looked younger, almost vulnerable. It was hard to reconcile this subdued woman with the manipulative predator who had nearly destroyed my family. Beside her sat Miguel Delgado, his face impassive as he surveyed the room. When his eyes met mine, I saw a flicker of something not remorse, but perhaps a grudging respect. The preliminary hearing proceeded with the formal precision of the justice system. Charges were read. Pleas were entered all not guilty, despite the overwhelming evidence. Bail was denied due to flight risk and the severity of the charges. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the witness stand with steady steps. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Marshall, led me through the details of the fraud, the threats, and the elaborate scheme to steal my property. "Mrs. Perez," she asked, "when did you first realize something was wrong?" I looked directly at Isabella as I answered. When my supposedly dead son texted me during his own funeral, a murmur ran through the courtroom. "And what did you do then?" "I met with my son, learned about the scheme targeting my property, and decided to fight back." Even knowing these defendants had allegedly killed others who stood in their way. Especially because of that. If they had done this to others and gotten away with it, they would keep doing it. Someone had to stop them. During cross-examination, Isabella's attorney tried to portray me as a confused elderly woman who had misunderstood legitimate business discussions. "Mrs. Perez, isn't it possible that you misinterpreted conversations about investment opportunities as threats?" I smiled slightly. I taught high school English for 42 years. Counselor. I'm quite skilled at understanding subtext. When Mr. Delgado told me they would make sure my son never bothers them again if I didn't sign over my property, the threat was unmistakable. "And these documents you claim contain confessions, did the defendants know what they were signing?" "They had every opportunity to read them. In fact, they spent nearly an hour reviewing them. The clauses were in plain English, not hidden in fine print. They were simply too arrogant to believe they could be outsmarted by someone they viewed as an easy mark." When I stepped down from the witness stand, I caught Mateo's eye. He gave me a subtle nod of pride that meant more than any applause. The hearing concluded with the judge setting a trial date and ordering all defendants to remain in custody. As we left the courthouse, reporters crowded around, shouting questions. "Mrs. Perez, how did you have the courage to take on these criminals? Did you ever fear for your life? What would you say to other elderly people who might be targeted by similar schemes?" I paused on the courthouse steps, considering the last question carefully. I would tell them that age is not a weakness. It's a strength. We've spent decades learning to read people, to trust our instincts, to recognize when something isn't right. Don't let anyone convince you that you're too old to fight back. You have wisdom they don't expect and courage they can't imagine. Back home that evening, Mateo and I sat on my porch with cups of tea, processing the day's events. "The prosecutor says there's too much evidence for them to get acquitted," he said. "They'll probably try to negotiate plea deals. Will you be okay with that if Isabella doesn't serve the full sentence?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think so. What matters most is that she can't hurt anyone else. And that you're safe. And that you're alive," I added, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "The rest is just details. Mom, there's something I've been meaning to ask you. What are you going to do with the Colorado property? That's life-changing money." I'd been thinking about this question for weeks. "First, I'm setting up college funds for Mrs. Alvarez's grandchildren. Then I'm establishing a foundation to help elderly victims of financial fraud. The rest will be split between us, enough for both of us to live comfortably without being excessive. You deserve to enjoy it, Mom, after everything you've sacrificed over the years." "I am enjoying it, but not through extravagance. I'm enjoying it by using it purposefully." I smiled at him. "Your grandfather bought that land because he believed in building a legacy. He would be happy to know it's helping others." 3 months later, justice moved forward when Isabella, Delgado, and the others accepted plea deals rather than face trial. The sentences ranged from 15 to 25 years, with no possibility of parole for at least a decade. More importantly, they provided information that helped the FBI identify and recover assets for dozens of other victims. On the 1-year anniversary of the fake funeral, Mateo and I visited the real grave of his grandfather in the small cemetery on the edge of town. We placed flowers on the simple headstone and stood in respectful silence. "He would be proud of you," Mateo said finally. "The way you fought for our family." "He would be proud of us both," I corrected gently. "It took courage to disappear the way you did, to give up your life to protect mine." As we walked back to the car, Mateo looked more at peace than he had in months. "You know what's ironic? Isabella and Delgado targeted you because they thought being older made you vulnerable. They never imagined it made you dangerous." I laughed. "Age and experience, the most underestimated weapons in the world." That evening, I received a letter from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, officially inviting me to join their Senior Advisory Council, a new initiative to help protect elderly Americans from complex fraud schemes. The director had added a handwritten note. "Your insights would be invaluable. Not everyone can outmaneuver professional criminals and live to tell about it." I called Mateo to share the news. "Are you going to accept?" he asked. "I think I will. After all, I've discovered I have a talent for fighting criminals. Seems a shame to waste it. From high school teacher to FBI consultant at 67, you're full of surprises. Mom, life is full of surprises. Mateo, some terrible, some wonderful. The trick is knowing which ones to fight and which ones to embrace." As I hung up the phone, I looked around my modest home, thinking about the journey of the past year. From the terror of that funeral to the triumph in the courtroom, I had discovered reserves of strength and courage I never knew I possessed. Isabella and her co-conspirators had seen only an aging widow, easy to manipulate and discard. They had calculated everything except the fierce determination of a mother protecting her son and the accumulated wisdom of 67 years of life. Their underestimation had been their downfall, and my salvation. The funeral had been fake, but my resurrection as a force to be reckoned with was gloriously, undeniably real. Thanks for listening. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for 2 other stories that are channel favorites.